Very much, Henry, for the invitation. A little Mercury there, who I'm sure will be enthralled, I hope, on this subject of landscape architecture. So the topic this evening is this book called The Landscape of Man by Geoffrey and Susan Jellicoe, which has just been updated and revised by me and published by the original publisher, Thames and Hudson. It was first published in 1975. So I've never done this before, republished or worked on somebody else's book, as it were, but I was very keen to do this because The Landscape of Man is a great and singular work. There is nothing else like it, I believe, in the entire canon of writing on architecture and design in any other design discipline. It's a vaunting, overarching survey of humankind's relationship to landscape and setting, and city design and urban design across all epochs, in all civilizations and in all cultures. The scope is absolutely breathtaking, and the book itself is, as you can imagine, a bit of a kind of stonking tome, as it were, with each spread of the book representing one of these epochs or civilizations, or occasionally a single place somewhere important like the Alhambra or the Taj Mahal. But as I say, it does remain unsurpassed, and there are reasons why this is the case. There are reasons why Geoffrey Jellicoe, the author of the text, and his wife Susan Jellicoe, who is the co-progenitor of the book in every way, there are reasons why they were able, both practically and philosophically and intellectually, to embark on such a project. So my role with the publisher, who the publisher at Thames and Hudson reminded me that we'd been talking about this for nearly a decade, actually, on and off. And I think I kept saying, no, we can't change this book. This book is an absolute classic book, and the text has to remain sort of sacrosanct. Please do come in. There's another seat here, and you'll be able to see the pictures. Otherwise, you won't. There you go. So I didn't want to change the text at all. Even the title, which is obviously very archaically gendered by today's standards, but really that was a decision the publisher made in the end. I mean, my feeling was, if we're not changing the text at all, just keep this title. I think people can basically handle it. My main remit, in a way, was to update all of the pictures in the book, because although it was published in 1975, then it was republished in 1987 and again in 1995. And can you believe, in 1995, all the pictures were still black and whites. Even in 95, Thames and Hudson could publish a book entirely comprised of black and white pictures. We forget that. But obviously that can't happen anymore. So my job was to update all of those photographs. And that was a very important role, I realised in the end. I hadn't realised embarking on it would be, because the Jellicoes had a very specific perspective on these things, which is a landscape perspective, which is very, very different, really, to an architectural perspective, which is quite object-based, on the building usually as an object in the landscape. And they didn't really want that. And Susan Jellicoe, as a photographer, went to great lengths to find these landscape perspectives. So I updated all the pictures to colour, and I also added a section at the end of the book from around 1990 to the present day to update it. So in this talk now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you about the Jellicoes, who they were, Geoffrey and Susan, first. Second, I'm going to tell you about the book and what it's like, and show you some examples of the projects which are in the book and the places in the book. And last of all, quite quickly, I think I'm going to tell you about my contribution, this section of 1990 to the present. So, to move immediately on to the Jellicoes. Here they are in their house, in their back garden in Highgate. They do look very nice. Everyone says they were very nice. Geoffrey Jellicoe particularly was a very friendly person and very, very supportive to many younger landscape architects. This is important because he was such a figure. His dates were 1900 to 1996. He was brought up on the Sussex coast in the south of England and studied architecture in London at the Architectural Association. He studied architecture. He moved into landscape architecture later. One of the first things he did, I mean, it was very long, as you well know, many of you, architecture is quite a long training. And in his 5th year at the Architectural Association, one of his tutors said, you really ought to go to Italy and look at the great Renaissance gardens there. And that's what he did with a friend called Geoffrey. And they actually produced a book on the Italian Renaissance garden. Places like this, Villa Gambaraia, which really remain just outside Florence. If you haven't been there, it's an extraordinary place. A very, very beautiful landscape design. And they walked these gardens and measured them. And Jock Shepherd did these drawings. So here you can see, this is the Villa Gambaraia with this very unusual, what was known as the bowling green, this great horizontal. So that's the house, a 4-square Tuscan villa, and the bowling green ends up at this strange grotto nymphaeum. Then you go up steps to that square thing in the middle there. That's the orangery terrace. Next to it's a little grotesque cabinetto, and these woodland areas on each side are the boscos, the woodlands, which are the darkness to play off the light, this sort of sense of duality. And then the bowling green goes down to the far end there on the right with these extraordinary views across the valley of the Arno, and Florence, the view down to the Duomo this way. But this is an amazing stroke of genius, really. This thought, it was probably by Piero Ligorio, I think, this design in the mid to late 17th century, although it's slightly shrouded in mystery. But this really was the wellspring of Jellicoe's interest, this interest in classicism. But he went on to become more of a landscape architect than an architect. He had this very long and varied career. Obviously, his career occurred at the time when modernism suddenly became all the rage. Although it wasn't in the early 20s in England when he was at the Architectural Association. And in his career, he sort of oscillated, if you like, between modernism and classicism as he went through. He became a great leader of the profession, and he did things like he founded the Landscape Institute, which is the professional body in the UK for landscape architects, and was really the first such professional body in the world. He also founded in 1948 the IFLAR, the International Federation of Landscape Architects, which is still a very important institution. And every year, I think it's every year or every other year, every year I think, they award the Geoffrey Jellicoe Award. That's their highest accolade, the IFLAR, is to award the Geoffrey Jellicoe Award. So his name is still out there and remembered. But he sat on lots of committees. He had links with the royal family, because early in his career he worked at royal residences, including Windsor. But as I say, he was also very good at dealing with artists and people with an interest in modern art and so on. He was never really formally an academic. He was principal of the Architectural Association during the Second World War, actually, but he was never really trained. Sometimes it's said, oh, he had a classical education. I don't quite know what that means. I think in England it means you went to a public school, which is a private school, and you learned a bit of Latin, and maybe he did that, but he didn't. The thing about Jellicoe, which was his strength, I think, was that he didn't have actually a very formal education, because that meant he was able to range over these subjects and really just pick and choose what he wanted in a very free and artistic way. So he's not always sort of correct. He changes his mind through his career. And he does terrible things like quote himself in his own essays, which anyone who's done academic work knows this is verboten. This is very taboo. So he was sort of artless in a funny sort of way at times, but this gave him this great freedom. And I'll tell you in a minute about I'll tell you now about the other thing which gave him great freedom. He became interested in modern art, middle of his life, really, not that early, but also he became interested when he was about 50 in the writings of Carl Jung, the psychologist and philosopher. Most famous book, Man and His Symbols. And Carl Jung's sort of big idea, I suppose, the one most people know about, and the one that Jellicoe latched onto, was the concept that there is a collective unconscious underpinning human experience, and that somehow out there in the ether, all of us are party to this collective unconscious and are all contributing to it and responding to it. And that collective unconscious is expressed in the world by means of archetypes, which are particular symbols, forms, ideas, which we all respond to. And Jellicoe believed that these archetypes could be detected and celebrated and illustrated in every single civilization and epoch of humankind. And this, if you like, gave him the confidence to be able to sort of start sentences in the Landscape of Man with phrases like, at this period, at this epoch, the mind of man was preoccupied with ... as if everyone somehow had the same view of the same things. He didn't exactly mean that, but he did mean that there was a commonality, if you like, to experience. And actually, I think that came out of modernism and the socialism that's associated with modernism. He was broadly a man of the left, and I think this idea is quite appealing in that sense, this idea that there's a commonality of experience and, if you like, almost morality. So as I say, he went to Italy, and all his career he acknowledged that, this is a quote, he had a deep feeling for classicism, as he put it. It's been there perpetually with me as a subconscious background. He's very keen on this idea of the subconscious. This came through from Jung. And the idea that the most important thing as an artist or a designer is to somehow tap into this subconscious. On the other hand, he was never afraid of talking about things like beauty and truth and perfection. These are concepts which the modernists were not comfortable with. These are classical ideals. But he somehow mingled all of this together in his own inimitable way. I mean, of these gardens, of these Italian gardens, he wrote about the Boboli Gardens behind the Palazzo Pitti in Florence. It's great Renaissance, Baroque, whatever you want to call them, gardens of the 17th century. And Villa Gambaria, this. And he said these were, quote, the beginning of modern psychological landscape art. This is how he saw these things. He began his career, so after this, after the Architectural Association, at places like this, Ditchley in Oxfordshire, working for very swanky patrons, in this case, Ronald and Nancy Tree. He worked, as I said, for the royal family at Windsor and Sandringham. So this is what he did at Ditchley, which is a very classical, neoclassical, but I think it's also got an element of modernism to it because it's so pared down and quiet. Then he did this. He got a commission to do this at a place called Cheddar Gorge in Somerset. And this is in 1934. This is the marvellously named Caveman Restaurant at Cheddar Gorge, which, as you can see, is this great modernist conception. But he was, he became a little disillusioned on and off with modernism. This is what he did. This was never realised, thank goodness, actually. This idea was called Motopia, and he made it for a company called Pilkington Glass, who are glass manufacturers. And his idea for Motopia, would you believe, is that people were going to live in those donut-shaped rings and also underneath. And these are roads going over the top of them and on roundabouts and so on, which was at the time when the motor car was seen as the great, hope for the future. And there was nothing wrong with the motor car. This is absolutely bizarre for us, of course. But he never really honestly believed this would be made. But this is a time when he was very into modernism. But this sort of thing, as you know, Villa Savoye by Le Corbusier, he was, a little kind of down on that. I mean, for this he said, he, as in Le Corbusier, built not for eternity, for a passing lift of space-time. I don't know what that phrase means, for a passing lift of space-time, but anyway. As if disassociated with the earth itself, the structure stood on pilotis, as you know, the little thin columns. And underneath, the landscape flowed with the movements of an 18th century landscape park. The concept establishes the architect as the mathematician, and the landscape designer as the biologist, and pinpoints the modern problem of the interweaving of mind and instinct in the environment. In other words, he saw this as a problem. He thought that the landscape and architecture and examples such as this are actually at odds with each other, are in tension with each other. I mean, some of us might say that's a rather fruitful tension, but it didn't really fit with Jellicoe. I mean, Jellicoe loved the irrational. And I'm not saying that modernism is not possessed of the irrational, because look at the Bauhaus, the early Bauhaus. But as it developed, he was less comfortable with it. He had a watershed moment in his career when he lost a competition for a new town. So in England, in the post-war period, in the 1950s and early 60s, a number of about a dozen brand new towns were built. And a lot of landscape architects and architects had commissions to make these. I mean, what a commission, a whole new town. And this was one of them, one of the most famous, Harlow New Town in Essex, just east of London. And Jellicoe put in a bid. This isn't his drawing, this is the drawing of Sir Frederick Gibbard, his friend, who won it. And Jellicoe talked to Gibbard afterwards. He was devastated he hadn't won. And it really decided that actually Gibbard had won because of his interest in modern art. And because he went to Gibbard's house and looked at what he had on his walls and on his windowsills, which were Henry Moore sculptural maquettes. And he had Paul Klee on the wall. And Paul Klee, for Jellicoe, he had a conversion really to modern art by looking at Klee. And people like Ben Nicholson. And he looked at this painting by Ben Nicholson of a place called Mousehole, which is spelt Mouse Hole, in Cornwall. And he said, in Mousehole 1947, Ben Nicholson revealed an affinity between geometry and agricultural landscape that went deeper than the arts and crafts movement. In 1948, Frederick Gibbard published his first plan for Harlow Newtown, Essex. The form grew from the complex of agricultural field patterns, but it had been rationalised into an art form that might be a landscape designer's interpretation of Mousehole in Cornwall. You see his point? And he used these as a touchstone for his design as he went through, and particularly this idea of the subconscious. He would look at a painting like this, or a painting by Paul Klee, and say that somehow they'd almost mystically approached almost the world of ideal forms that exist beyond. It's a bit like Plato and Plato's idea of the ideal forms that exist somehow beneath our visual consciousness. So as I say, he tended to read very widely because of this essentially kind of lack of an education. If he'd been to Oxford or Cambridge, he would not have written The Landscape of Man. There's no way he would have done that. Because he saw the process of intellectual engagement as a creative art in itself. It wasn't a matter of analysis and synthesis in a conventional academic sense. And he often sort of thinks out loud in his writing. Jellicoe was wholly sincere. He was totally unpretentious. He was never ironic. So some people have said that his work is postmodernist in feeling, particularly the later work, because he carried on working into his 90s. Jellicoe said to architectural students when he lectured to them, life begins at 80. And it sort of did. He had a really wonderful flowering of his career in his 80s. He had loads of work. But he wasn't postmodernist because he didn't really think like that. He wasn't making jokes in his work. He was a very nice, affable man in person, but in his work he was very serious and sincere, I would say. Sincere. As a result, his work is very idiosyncratic and sort of unpredictable. And there's not really a style, a school of Jellicoe. So it's hard to find people actually under the age of 40 who've even heard of Jellicoe. Although I'm hoping that this book will help remedy that to some extent. So this is a sort of the work he was doing. I mean, this is an interesting late work from 1980. This is one episode in the design, an unfinished design at Sutton Place in Surrey, which is a very important Elizabethan house, completely private now. You can't get into it, but for a while you could. And this was one of the climax, if you like. The whole landscape he created was really a metaphor for a human life. It began with a lake, which was in the form of a fetus, essentially, and moved through various stages and ended here, which can be seen, which is a massive version in marble of a Ben Nicholson maquette of a little sculptural model this big. You can see how big this is. It's actually massive. And it's a very profound moment. And it could mean death or it could mean rebirth. We're not sure, and it wasn't really Jellicoe's way to really tell us, what he didn't used to prompt us as to what to think about these things. So that's a great work, great landscape work. But I think his greatest work, anyway, that's a drawing, one of his very fine drawings he did, very complicated. This is more of a mind map than an architectural drawing, don't you think? I mean, it's like something that really has come out of the subconscious, it seems to me. That's part of the walled garden at Sutton Place. So this is the Kennedy Memorial at Runnymede in Surrey on the Thames. It was an acre of land given to the American people by Britain after the death of JFK. And Jellicoe had the commission to create this landscape, which is essentially a monumental walk. You walk across a field, a pasture, and then you walk up through woodland, up a stone path, and reach here, this wonderful monumental, a great dramatic idea is how he put it. And this is the walkway through. He actually got the commission just before he went to Japan, the day before he went to Japan for the first time. And if you go to Ryoanji, the famous garden in Kyoto, the dry garden, the Kariansui garden, sometimes called a Zen garden, to get to it, no photographer ever takes pictures of this. You go up a path exactly like this. So I think that Jellicoe did slightly sort of lift it. I mean, later on he said there was some local particular influence from Japan on this work, which is him sort of fessing up. But that's fine, he's a designer, you're allowed to do this. But at the end he says, this climactic stone tablet, he said it's like a Greek temple. And he said, quote, whose presence lends meaning to a primitive scene, aloof and heroic. These are the sorts of ideas which he went on to promulgate, if you like, in The Landscape of Man. And then he did other works. This is Chute in Dorset with famous water gardens. And also he did get a commission for a new town, Hemel Hempstead, and this is the water garden. So in the middle of one of these towns, you essentially have this river and a pastoral landscape. It's extraordinary. It's still there and has recently been essentially saved. So Susan on the left. So Susan Jellicoe, she became a plant enthusiast, and she advised Geoffrey on a lot of planting schemes. He had little interest in planting and plants, it has to be said. Susan came from a highly academic background and a diplomatic background. She was educated here in the Sorbonne as well as at St Paul's School in London. And in the war she worked for the Ministry of Information and then really became a photographer. She collaborated with Geoffrey on a number of books and with other people. So these are some of the books she wrote. Things we see, that was a modernist book in the 50s. The Gardens of Mughal India, you can see she's credited at the bottom. Photographs and Research. This is an all-female book, you note. Sylvia Crowe, the great landscape designer, and Sheila Hayward, an undersung landscape designer of the period. And then this one, this great work, The Oxford Companion to Gardens, which Geoffrey and Susan were really the lead editors of. She was also on the Observer magazine as a journalist, and she edited the landscape magazine of the Landscape Institute for 20 years. So she had a great career in her own right. And Jellicoe said that Susan brought a certain academic rigour to his wider reading and his mode of thinking. And she also basically, through the founding of IFLAR, so in 1948 Jellicoe founded it, IFLAR, the International Federation of Landscape Architects, every other year had a conference somewhere in the world, Africa, Australia, the Far East, all over the place, Scandinavia, and they went to every single one of these. And after the conference, they went on the official tour with everyone else, but then they went on their own tour. And it was often Susan who organised that because she had all these diplomatic links, was very confident, spoke 4 or 5 languages. Basically, Geoffrey would have probably fallen off a boat into the Nile and drowned. So I don't want to characterise Susan as the sort of, you know, the capable woman behind the great man at all. It wasn't that, I'm not saying that. But she definitely had that role as well as everything else she did. Now, the problem is that, with the book, is that Susan took a lot of the photos in the book. I don't know exactly how many, probably a third, 40%. But because they're all black and white, and because my job was to change all the pictures to colour, what were we going to do? So the way we've done it is we have included a number of Susan's original photographs in the book, very prominently at the beginnings of sections. So it didn't really work trying to mingle them up with all the colour ones. So here's some examples. Delphi. So you can see what I mean? You know, sorry, it's not a brilliant repro, but you know, she was able to capture the majesty of these scenes. Giza, looking onto the Nile. Greece. And this is at Rievaulx Abbey in Yorkshire. I think this is my favourite of all Susan's pictures. It's just amazing. And normally this picture's taken from above because there's a terrace above it, the Rievaulx Terrace, which the National Trust has. But Susan often took different views. She didn't take the obvious views. And this is an example of that. So anyway, let's get on to the book. This is part 2. So as I say, enveloping the whole book is this. This is in Central Park, by the way. Does that read to you? Does it look? Can you see it? Because somebody said, "Oh, it's Central Park." I hadn't recognised it, but we used this on the cover because it was actually used for the 2nd edition. So again, I always wanted to honour the Jellicoes' original intentions with this. So, yeah, I've talked about Carl Jung And he said, Jellicoe put it, the argument is that the designed landscape has always been a projection of the human psyche into its natural environment. And Jellicoe refined these ideas of Jung. In fact, he doesn't talk about collective unconscious in the book. He doesn't ever use that phrase. But he does use the phrase the collective landscape. He uses it in the first pages of the book, actually. And he didn't really get into talking a lot. At this particular moment, when he wrote this book in the mid-70s, he said himself he'd slightly fallen out of interest. He didn't fallen out of love with Jung, but he was less interested in Jung, but it was still in there. And he also took on board Jung, like all the phenomenologists, including Heidegger, who always said, listen to what I say, but don't quote my theories. The idea is that you listen to the theories and absorb them, and then you bracket them out, as they would put it, and try to come to things fresh without theory, as it were. So he never wanted to theorize in this book. So the text of The Landscape of Man is not difficult to read. It's not full of abstruse theorizing, despite the fact it's based on the ideas of Jung. Because, as Jung said, as soon as you start intellectualizing and analyzing and making a superstructure of that kind, it's a distraction. It's better to be fresh and come to it. Anyway, obviously the idea of the subconscious and all humanity on some sort of journey where we're all absorbing all previous civilizations, that makes the concept of history massively important, doesn't it? Because that's what history is. It's our understanding of all these previous epochs and how they express themselves. So that's another reason why I think the book is important in an era, and I'm a historian and a critic, but a historian, in an era when history seems to be barely taught in the universities, actually. But Jellicoe was very clear that this is the way forward, this is the way to think as a designer. And in my own experience as a critic, I have to say as an aside, all the very best designers have some passionate interest in some element of history, of architectural history, of landscape history. It actually doesn't matter that they've got it wrong. It doesn't matter that they have there are mistakes, as it were, from a historian's point of view, because they're using this material in a very creative way. And that, I think, is one of the good things about the book. So the book that's Jellicoe, by the way. And this is a typical spread, slightly randomly chosen from the book, which gives you a sense of how it works. It's very unfashionable to have a book which looks like this now. And I'm really delighted that Thames and Hudson actually published it with the same kind of visual integrity. You don't get books with tiny little pictures like this in them anymore, little diagrams. You know, most spreads on The Landscape of Man have at least four or five pictures on them. And a lot of them are quite small, so it's a mixture of drawings, photography, obviously, original illustrations. This is about the Vospark in Amsterdam. There's a Mondrian, as you can see at the top left corner, and the Vospark itself, shown in various iterations, including Jellicoe's own section, to show the different levels of it. Funnily enough, he used the Mondrian on this page to show how it wasn't like the Vospark. That, in fact, that grid is disrupted, as it were. Anyway, so that's a typical spread, and the book starts with this image of the globe. And he doesn't shy away from talking about Genesis. He says the sun is the centre of a system of solid bodies, part of a galaxy that floats in an infinite void. The Earth appears to have been created out of gases about 4,700 million years ago, an imperfect sphere spinning upon its axis faster than today. The axis itself, originally parallel to the orbit, came imperceptibly to tilt, and thus to present a differing surface to the sun. The surface was chaotic. Cloud masses hung over a barren volcanic landscape, so hot that the constant rain instantly turned into steam. This weird scenery was illuminated by a sun that rose and set in much less time than today. There were no oceans, no atmosphere, and no life. New paragraph. Life. The surface... He's moving us on. The surface cooled, the water vapours condensed, atmosphere was created, and life began. With life also began individuality, for evolution dictates that no two forms can be exactly alike. So from the genesis of the earth, Jellicoe is talking about individuality. He's really relating it to human experience, actually, because for Jellicoe, the mind, a human experience, he got this from Jung, he got this from phenomenology. This is all that matters. All we have is our own minds, he says, to experience the world. So even something like the birth of the globe. I mean, talk about stepping back and looking at the big picture. Here we begin. I wish Jellicoe had been on the Artemis mission in that rocket. Then we wouldn't have had to put up with these platitudes from the NASA scientists and astronauts who seem to tell us the same thing again and again and again. I looked out of the window. Isn't it amazing how small the world looks? Thanks for that. Anyway, Jellicoe would have been a lot better commentator, I think. He moves a lot, so with apologies to NASA, obviously, I'm joking. So he moves on to early prehistoric, the Caves of Lascaux. And again, he has original thoughts on this. He says, despite varied scales, the animals are closely related to one another, to their rock wall, and to the cavern as a whole. The design is complex in time as well as space, for one animal has later been drawn over another with a respect for the past. Considered as a whole, the cave paintings are the first and still the most pure of all the intuitive arts of landscape design. So he's owning the Caves of Lascaux for landscape design, for his subject, if you like. But can you see what he means? He's talking about them as an animated, not an object, but as a sort of animation, a reimagining of their lives, which seem so distant. Then Karnak, and what he said about Karnak, the stones are regimented, probably for ritual. But each stone is individual with an overwhelming personality. I mean, I'm laughing because I find the joy in this, for him to say such a thing, that these stones have overwhelming personalities. The White Horse at Uffington on the Berkshire Downs in England, cut by the Celts about 100 AD, he calls it the first engraving on any landscape of a major work of art. He states, the White Horse, difficult to see from the ground, was almost certainly made for the gods. How did he know? Well, he thinks himself into these distant cultures, that's how. He's like a sort of method actor, like Robert De Niro was, thinking himself into the mind of a Mayan. He's not afraid to do this. And it's Jung gives him the power to do it. I couldn't do it. I tried, because when I was doing my last section of the book, I thought I'd try to ventriloquize Jellicoe. I tried to be a Jungian and think like this. And it just seemed absurd for me, because I haven't sort of signed up. So I did a fairly useful, I hope, précis of landscape history over the last 30 years. But the point with this, and the point Jellicoe was trying to make, and I guess many of us in this field try to make, is that these aren't just objects. The setting, look at this image. The setting, it's all about the landscape and the countryside around it. The actual engraving itself is obviously the focus, but it's the setting is so important to it. And it's the same with places like Easter Island. A colossal scale, he says, among which in time and space men moved like pygmies. Into Persia, he takes us through all the different, I'm going to mainly do a very quick roundup really of the ancient world, which I think is the really special part, the most special part of the book. Isfahan, the city of gardens, bombed recently, unfortunately, capital of the Safavid dynasty from 1598, flowering in an arid desert, laid out by Shah Abbas I. This is his own drawing of Isfahan, which is a city of gardens, as you can see. And with these, he uses this illustration with an oriental plane, the Chinar in the background, top right, very lovely rendition of that, and all sorts of shenanigans going on in the garden as well. And then explains how that central alley, left-right alley there, A, is lined with oriental planes in ancient Isfahan. And the complex of buildings in the city, like this, takes us to Granada and to the Alhambra. Again, it's very important that they're showing the Sierra Nevada in the background, which is the reason the city is there and feeding the city with water. But also these massive towers. It's a little bit almost like Les Très Riches, one of the beautiful illuminated manuscripts from medieval France, which populated the imagination of architects and garden makers for half a millennia and more. But also at the Alhambra, he and Susan were careful to include images like this, which you'd never see in any other book. The way that the palace connects with the city around it. Equally, if you go to, this is the Taj Mahal, but they don't really focus on the main image of the Taj Mahal, which is if you Google Taj Mahal and look at the images that come up, there are hundreds of images, all of the same thing, just the front of the Taj Mahal. It's wonderful, but it doesn't show this, which is what they were interested in, which is the river terrace of the Taj on the other side, and where you can see the fort in the background along the river, the Red Fort as it's known. As Jellicoe says, this is the view that Shah Jahan himself, who built the Taj Mahal, contemplated when he was a prisoner here in the last years of his life. And the view back from the fort to the Taj Mahal. It was really, really difficult to find these images. Virtually no one does this. And then he gives us a map. So at the bottom, J is the Taj Mahal. Opposite I is the projected site of Shah Jahan's own tomb, which would be in black marble. And then the processional river landscape going up the River Jumna. He shows us other sites. The stupa of Borobudur, where he says mystic Buddhism find its supreme monument in the middle of the 8th century. He says, it's a pure mandala created from a hill in the centre of the Kedu plain, a spiritual response to the surrounding volcanic peaks. So he's relating this to volcanic mountains. As the pilgrim ascends, he passes through life, from birth to death, and thence to the realm of the void or absolute, beyond form or thought. The sequences of this metaphysical journey are narrated in sculpture. So this plan shows the succession of 5 square terraces that are the earthly world. The square changes to the circle of the cosmos, and then there are 3 terraces on which are seated 72 Buddhas in lattice stupas. He explains all of this to us. No one else has ever done this in the landscape scheme. And he goes to Angkor Wat, as you can see, set in the jungle. It's a water landscape, and Jellicoe spends most of his time talking about irrigation, which is why this is here. Again, about the same time as Borobudur, mid-9th century. And he talks about water, basically, about runoff, and things, sorts of phrases which are important to contemporary landscape architects. He says, the whole city was encompassed by a dike, appearing as an island during floods. Having ensured astonishing fertility and food supply, the king, God on earth, then built his personal symbolic mountain temple to house his kingly essence. Because of the ease with which life was sustained, spare labour was plentiful, and its utilisation to absorb energy clearly desirable. Stone was brought easily to the site by water, piled high according to a basic plan, and carved in situ as narrative. Carved in situ as narrative. He doesn't really explain what he means by that, but that's a very Jellicoe kind of a phrase. He does have these open-ended ideas sometimes, but here we are. It's for us to move along from them. And he also shows us Angkor Thom, a sort of sub-temple of the Angkor Wat complex. And he says these jagged silhouetted towers are suitable, as he says, to the misty light of the humid jungle. He believes that the silhouettes of these towers sort of mingle with the shape and forms of a jungle. He takes us to China. He shows us this extraordinary image. You see the sage at bottom right in his hut thinking and writing, almost embraced by the pine. But who's that floating in the air? That's the same sage. The sage has come out of his body, out of his hut, and is floating in the air. I think this is Jellicoe. This is Jellicoe writing his book. 16th century painting called Dreaming of Immortality in a Thatched Cottage. Jellicoe says the artist has transmuted the earthbound body of the sleeping sage into a floating, weightless, abstract form, symbolic of his spiritual objectives and aspirations. He continues, this dream of immortality seems to inform all Chinese art, as though art itself were a middle distance between the visible and the invisible. Architecture itself, so peculiar to China and so constant in its spirit, seems to have evolved in a way which parallels the evolution of writing. He tells us about the character of a tree, originally used on bronze castings, which became the diagram, the pictogram for a park. And then with this pictogram became the development of a building technique. European structures with a rigid triangular truss on load-bearing walls, which you architecture folks know all about. But here you have the Chinese version with a complete frame system, stabilised by a heavy roof of clay tiles, and he illustrates it with the Phoenix Hall at Byodo Inn, which he says is the only pure example of this. I'm not qualified to say whether that's true or not. Then he takes us to Japan and says this pictorial design technique had become professionalised with the mingling of painting, architecture and landscape architecture. This is the Golden Pavilion in Kyoto, 1397, rebuilt later. The place of contemplation, the building appears to float above the water, as he said. But then he gives us a diagram and shows how the lake is divided into two parts by an island, and that beside the pavilion is enlivened by lesser islands and tortoise-shaped rocks. He says this skillful play on optics induces vision from the pavilion to focus on the foreground complexities, allowing the water beyond the island, seen through the stems of trees, to melt into imaginative distance. So I think he and Susan spent a long time at these sites thinking about these matters. And I think Susan's photography and her need, this isn't Susan's own photograph, it's a colour one, but it's the same perspective that she had. They spent a long time there thinking, talking, I imagine, about how these places work, the mechanics of them. He talks about this one, the Silver Pavilion in Kyoto, late 15th century, which he relates to painting. It says it's a painted scene, it's a pictorial painting. He takes us to amazing places like Machu Picchu. But he doesn't just show us this image, which is breathtaking, obviously. On the same page, he gives us this, which is a plan of all the agricultural terraces around what you could see, around the settlement. So it's not just, this isn't holiday photographs like brochure. He's going to the mechanics of how these places worked. I haven't really got time to go into it, but he describes in detail in the book how this worked. And he did it at all phases. So later in the book, he gets into town planning and 20th century and Harlow New Town. And I sort of joked to myself, I didn't put it in the book, but I wanted to sort of say the book goes from Machu Picchu to Milton Keynes. Milton Keynes is a rather benighted place, a new town that people unfairly sort of laugh at in England. He takes us to Egypt, obviously, and the pyramids, which he describes as perhaps the simplest and most fundamental form in all architecture. He points out that there are 3 pyramids, although 2 are often only shown, asymmetrically placed but axial arranged according to the compass points, making clear the interplay between pyramid and cosmos. Jellicoe says the primordial geometry of Egypt reflects a view of the world in which every object and every being had its allotted place, which could never change. He says the pyramids are perhaps the most dramatic and ancient example of apparently permanent construction within a landscape dimension, and that's true. How can this not be landscape design as well as architecture? It's his cosmic perspective. He talks about the Nile and how that, again, itself, the huge Nile, is a form of processional landscape with all of these sites along it. And the tomb paintings at Thebes, 1,000 years showing paradise, 1,000 years before the Islamic tradition. This is an image of the afterlife, and it's got gardens in it and little ducks you can see in those ponds and so on, and trees and so on, very detailed. One of the inscriptions in these tombs reads, and Jellicoe quotes it, "May I wander round my pool each day for evermore. May my spirit sit on the branches of the grave garden I've prepared for myself. May I refresh myself each day under the leaves of my plane tree." He tells us about other places in Egypt, Karnak and Luxor, and the way that the monumental avenue here of sphinxes links in 2 directions other important sites, following the setting sun to the west into the mountains. So this avenue of ram's head sphinxes leads to this, the mortuary temple of Queen Hatshepsut, a series of ramped terraces originally planted with hundreds of myrrh trees, with the buildings seemingly hewn from the rock face. So we don't know exactly what things like this processional avenue to this mean. This is slightly lost to us, what the Egyptians had got from this, but obviously it's of huge ritual significance, including the process of moving through the landscape. So Jellicoe explains to us the concept of locomotion. And he does that in Athens as well, at the Parthenon. Obviously we have this establishing shot of the Acropolis and the Parthenon on top of it. But he tells us about the Panathenaic procession approaching the Propylaea, which would wind up past the Temple of Nike, where he says rock and architecture in direct association. And eventually you'd wind up past these sites. And you do this, actually, even now as a tourist. And it's not really talked about, the experience of walking and looking upwards particularly. That's very important at the Parthenon. And Jellicoe gives us that, tells us about that. And then at the end, you see these wonderful buildings. And at the end, you come out into the precinct, the sacred precinct, with the caryatids on your left. And there was a huge statue of Athena in the middle of this precinct, he reminds us. He says the whole precinct is a study in interlocking views and of the play of light upon architectural forms. Then he just moves on. He takes us through all these different cultures into Christianity and places where people wanted to live in seclusion, the idea of being a hermit. The Brontokian monastery at Mistra around 1300. Extremes of seclusion like Meteora in northwest Thessaly in Greece. And he moves on to more perhaps familiar territory, the Villa d'Este and the Renaissance in Italy. There's not much on Great Britain in the book, by the way. I think the British are often characterised as rather inward-looking, but Jellicoe doesn't fall into that trap. And he tells us about the Italian Renaissance. Interesting, he chooses the Villa d'Este. Most people prefer the Villa Lante nowadays, I would say, as an exemplar of the Renaissance garden. But he loves the Villa d'Este, and he gives kind of feedback in the book, as if he's almost giving feedback at an architectural seminar to students. He says, the plan is accomplished, the modelling on the steep hillside firm, the detail robust, and the transition between gardens and landscape clearly designed. Overall is the sense of Roman domination of landscape. So you can kind of go into that mode as well, into slight sort of teacher mode, and just tell us why this works practically as a landscape design. And tells us all about the wonderful fountains all the way through the garden, as he said, spread lavishly and musically through the garden, because some of these are musical features as well, and he used that at Chute in Dorset, his own design, the idea of a musical terrace. He also relates, this is that Villa d'Este, there are paintings dotted through the book, not just modern ones by Paul Klee. This is Tintoretto, Susanna and the Elders, 1556. And he describes this as an early exercise in landscape design. And he gives us this little plan, showing, so you see these creepy guys, the old guys, these are the elders, sort of spying and creeping around Susanna. And this is his plan, which sort of shows how it's a landscape design with the trellis screens dividing it all. So he's sort of saying that this is like a landscape conception, essentially. And I think he's right. It's a different way of thinking about landscape. Giorgione, the first Renaissance painter really to paint landscapes, it was more of a mythical setting. But I think Jellicoe is drawn to this because it's like an engineered landscape setting. And he takes us to France, obviously, and to Le Notre and this wonderful garden at Sceaux, where he observes actually this massive water parterre really dwarfs the chateau. It's really all about the water and the sky, actually, the relationship with the sky. And then he takes us into the 20th century. As I say, there's a lot in the 20th century. I'm not going to talk about that now because we haven't got time. But one of the places he mentions is the Louisiana Museum in Copenhagen. And he likes this because the sculptures are sort of indoor and outdoor. There are trees inside the glass-walled building. It's on a lake. You can see the Henry Moore. It's very much a Jellicoe sort of a place. So my section at the end, now we're on to the third and final bit of my talk, which I'll whiz through quite quickly, I suppose, is a little sliver. I've done, my text is about 10% of the whole book. It's a little kind of sliver at the end. And in it, I just tried to talk about the major trends in landscape design over the last 35, 40 years or so. So places like this, the modernist inheritance, Parc André Citroën here in Paris. And postmodernism, festive postmodernism, things like this. The Piazza Italia in New Orleans by Venturi. Peter Walker's work for IBM in Texas. And here in Paris, I think the main postmodernist landscape that survives is the Parc de la Villette by Bernard Tschumi. And I talk about how that gives on to the conceptualist movement in landscape, and the foundational act of the conceptualist movement is Martha Schwartz's bagel garden, which she made using real bagels, obviously a riff on a parterre garden, so bringing in the idea of wit and concepts and ideas to the fore. And then her pupils, actually, the people who worked in her offices, is Ken Smith, the roof garden at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, entirely made of artificial materials. Again, actually a riff on Baroque gardens. But I guess I talk in the book about a few themes which Jellicoe didn't mention and I thought needed to be in there. And there are 4 themes. I'm not going to go into them at length, but I'll mention what they are. First is ecology and the naturalistic turn. Obviously in the context of climate change, this is huge. And the naturalistic turn from the mid-90s really meant that lots of landscape architects and garden designers were really depending on big perennials and grasses and so on, really to give a sense of a naturalistic presence in the garden. The second one is the post-industrial context. Lots of docklands and other parts of cities reused, re-energized through landscape design. The third is the garden as a work of art gardens. Show you 1 or 2 of those quickly. And finally, community gardening and city farms and so on, which I think are very important in the contemporary context. So those are the 4 things I think Jellicoe missed out. There are different reasons why he did it. So this is the Pensthorpe Nature Reserve by Piet Aldolf, who's the Dutchman, who is the leader, I guess, of this naturalistic turn at the moment, the so-called New Perennials school. Jellicoe wasn't very interested in this sort of thing because for him, it was all about the mind of man. In fact, in the book he says, in a period of history when all available energy is spent in the investigation of nature, very little attention is paid to the essence of man, which is his psyche. Okay, well it's true, but it's sort of slightly out of kilter with our age, isn't it? It's very anthropocentric, I suppose, but that for him was the centre. So for Jellicoe, when he discusses ecology, he does it in the concept of children's playgrounds and zoos, really. So I sort of felt that we needed to have a little bit more of this sort of thing. This is the Olympic Park in London by the Sheffield School, James Hitchmo and so on. So big landscape architecture projects as well in this sort of style. And around the world, these sorts of plants, so this is desert planting in Arizona by Steve Martino. These sorts of plants are being used in domestic garden design as well. The second one, the post-industrial context, this is Richard Haag's park in Seattle, which is really the first one done in the 1975. An old gasworks, obviously, which was formed into a public park. And what you see here, and it was 1975, the first post-industrial park, is this massive kind of cliche, I suppose, of contemporary landscape design, which is this idea of vegetation somehow overcoming nature and thereby healing it morally, almost. So that still happens a lot. You see that a lot in fine art at the moment. If you go to the Venice Biennale, that's kind of the theme which artists latch onto. But in landscape architecture, it's been a little bit more sophisticated with places like this, the Duisburg Nord steelworks in the Ruhr Valley in Germany, where Peter Latz didn't really do what Haag did. He, in fact, honours the history of these steelworks by leaving a lot of it intact, and you can go into the old control rooms and so on, and really try to honour the history of it. So, of course, there were lots of people living, although it's now derelict, there are lots of people living in the area who worked at that steelworks, and they don't want to have their entire living and their life sort of trashed, as it were, by kind of do-gooding designers coming in afterwards and telling them that somehow they got everything wrong. So that's a different. I don't think Jellicoe liked post-industrialism because when he was writing in the 80s, it was highly capitalistic. In London, it was to do with Canary Wharf and Margaret Thatcher. So it was very, very money and investment led. And I think as a good North London sort of lefty, if you like, Jellicoe was quite uncomfortable with that. And also, I think he thought that sometimes the results were a little, probably, I think, he thought the results were perhaps a little flimsy because they can feel a bit that way in terms of the conceptual underpinning of some of these post-industrial designs. So I think he didn't really write about this. This is Tourenscape. This is post-industrialism in China, where lots of these new towns in China have these incredible water-based designs by Professor Conyan Yu, who unfortunately was killed in a plane crash about 6 months ago. But he's had the biggest landscape architecture company in the world, Tourenscape, based in Beijing. They're doing these sorts of things. It's post-industrial, essentially. Then the artistic garden. This is Derek Jarman and Prospect Cottage on the beach at Dungeness. So again, places like this. This is Jenks's Garden of Cosmic Speculation in Scotland, which is all about cosmological theory and scientific theory. These are fractals or fractional dimensions which exist between the dimensions. So these are what you might call singular artist gardens, gardens made by people, not necessarily... Jenks was the man who invented postmodernism in the 1980s. He defined it. Then he went on to make this. Jarman was a filmmaker, and he made this. This is Ian Hamilton Finlay's Little Sparta, an amazing... He was a concrete poet, Amazing garden in Scotland, the most important garden, I believe, to have been made in the last 60, 70 years, probably. And this is Niki de Saint-Phal, French artist in Italy, with her tarot garden, which just looks extraordinary, is extraordinary. I mean, you can see on the left there, that's her huge Earth Mother. That's one of the Earth Mother's breasts you can see. And in fact, Niki de Saint-Phal lived in that breast for a while, because it was hollow. It's all full of mirrored glass. So it's also a feminist work as well, this one. But Jellicoe didn't include any of this. He was actually made some slightly slighting references about Ian Hamilton Finlay and Richard Long, the land artist. Again, I think he was a bit uncomfortable with the idea of the art garden because it's not scalable. He really came from a modernist background, and the point with that is you need scalable solutions. None of this isn't scalable. It's pretty scaled up already, isn't it? So what use is it, sort of thing? You know, had quite a utilitarian attitude, so it didn't really include this. And then the last one was community gardens, which I'm very interested in. I founded the Chelsea Fringe, which is a community garden festival in London and around the world, ran for 12 years. And that's all about, you know, people actually taking control of their local community through guerrilla gardening in the streets, through community gardens like this one, the Dalston Eastern Curve in East London. And I show this image. This is designed by Gibbons and Co. J&L Gibbons in London, which is a really good building, interesting building. Just shows that community gardens don't have to look really messy and kind of down and just grungy. They can be very beautiful as well and impressive. So that's the last thing. And again, Jellicoe, the city farm movement was getting going at the time, but it wasn't something that interested Jellicoe particularly. So that's the book. So Jellicoe's career, I'm going to finish now, which is his life. His career and his life was a quest. It was never ending. He used to tell people, all my life is a quest. All I'm doing is searching, grasping for something. He said that in an interview towards the end of his life. And he was always looking and always moving forward. And in that light, I was reading a lot of Jung, trying to understand where Jellicoe was coming from. And I came across this formative memory of Carl Jung, described in his memoir, Memories, Dreams, Reflections in 1961. And it's Carl Jung remembering his earliest memory, really, which actually occurs in a garden. And I think it's redolent somehow of the way Jellicoe thought. So Jung wrote, I am lying in a pram, in the shadow of a tree. It is a fine, warm summer day, the sky blue and golden sunlight darting through green leaves. The hood of the pram has been left up. I've just awakened to see the glorious beauty of the day and have a sense of indescribable well-being. I see the sun glittering through the leaves and blossoms of the bushes. Everything is wholly wonderful, colourful and splendid. I'll leave it there with that thought. Thank you.